Now, this is, by the way, one of my clients. Now, would Dr. Szasz seriously suggest that this unfortunate woman's mania, panic, and self-mutilation are intentional? Perhaps also that she is, to use a frequently proffered cliche, quote, just doing it to get attention? And if so, whose attention? Her long-absent mother? Her physically abusive father? Possibly. My view is that most so-called mental illness is but a variation on this theme of parental distancing, violence, and abandonment with, of course, ongoing denial by the family that anything is wrong. Szasz disagrees profoundly with all this. As we have seen, he considers all such behavior as malingering, that is, conduct with intent to deceive. The key word here is intent. For Szasz, the behavior of the mentally ill is always intentional. Perhaps so, but then we must ask, what is the nature of that intent? Is it to deceive, or is it, as I prefer to think, to return to our example, a futile attempt to escape the guilt, shame, and despair for being the unwanted child of parents who themselves have been traumatized by their fate? It might not be going too far to suggest that Szasz also sees the behavior of the mentally ill as rule-governed, a view with which I am very much in agreement, but again one must ask, what are those rules? As I have said elsewhere, they are the tacit, often secret rules of the family. Szasz, however, as we have also seen, does not care to locate the etiology of unwanted behavior within the family. Szasz does not seem to object to psychotherapy as such. His target is involuntary institutional psychiatry. What distressed individuals do with their own money in seeking help with their difficulties is not his concern. Outside of his discussions of Mesmer and Heinroth, he seems little concerned whether such help is effective, and he has no position that I can discern regarding the use of drugs to achieve therapeutic ends within a voluntary doctor-patient relationship. Like most libertarians, Szasz is distressed by the coercive aspects of psychiatry. In 1976, he said, the Society of Bleuler, Kraepelin, and Freud wanted them to extend the boundaries of medicine over morals and law, and they did so. It wanted them to extend the boundaries of illness from the body to behavior, and they did so. It wanted them to disguise conflict as psychopathology and confinement as psychiatric therapy, and they did so. Okay, now the next topic. Individuals are moral agents responsible for their behavior. At a time when much effort is devoted in our society to depoliticizing discussions in the name of political correctness, Szasz characterizes himself as trying to re-ethicize and repoliticize the language of psychiatry. Sustained adherence to the myth of mental illness, he says, quote, allows people to avoid facing the problem of personal significance. What should man do with himself? For what should he live? People want to believe that mental health, conceived as the absence of mental illness, automatically ensures the right and safe choices in the conduct of life. Treating the medical metaphors of modern psychiatry as literal reflects and reinforces our modern aversion to moral conflict, human tragedy, and plain language. If we can succeed in stripping away the mask from the ideology of modern psychotherapy, we discover the perennial interests and institutions of mankind: sex and significance, power and prestige, race, religion, and the family, end of quote. He says quite perceptively, quote, in our scientific theories of behavior, we have failed to accept the simple fact that human relations are inherently fraught with difficulties, and to make them even relatively harmonious requires much patience and hard work. In short, when one speaks of mental illness, the norm from which deviation is measured is a psychosocial and ethical standard, yet the remedy is sought in terms of medical measures that, it is hoped and assumed, are free from wide differences of ethical value. Which brings me to my favorite statement by Szasz. Quote, the idea that our life is a dark mystery, that our personal problems cannot be understood by common sense, intelligent inquiry, and some earnest effort, that the secrets of our inner life or unconscious mind can be penetrated and unraveled only by a few select adepts. All this is false. Understanding why people act the way they do, what they value and what gives their lives meaning, is far easier than understanding the atomic structure of matter or the chemical composition of stars millions of light years from Earth, end quote. In short, he says, quote, psychotherapy is secular ethics. It is the religion of the formally irreligious. with its language, which is not Latin but medical jargon, with its codes of conduct, which are not ethical but legalistic, and with its theology, which is not Christianity but positivism." End of quote. But Szasz is at his most incisive, his most vehement, when he deals directly with the coercive aspects of psychiatry. Quote, "They were not primarily physicians," he says of Kraepelin, Bloyle, and so on. "They were wardens." He continues, quote, "Oppression and degradation are unpleasant to behold, and are therefore frequently disguised or concealed. One method for doing so is to segregate in special areas, as in camps or hospitals, the degraded human beings. Another is to conceal the social realities behind the fictional facade of what we call, after Wittgenstein, language games. While psychiatric language games may seem fanciful, the psychiatric idiom is actually only a dialect of the common language of oppressors. The defenders of psychiatric imprisonment call their institutions hospitals, the inmates patients, and the keepers doctors. They refer to the sentence as treatment and to the deprivation of liberty as protection of the patient's best interests." End of quote. I have already noted that Szasz says almost nothing about psychiatric drugs, their effectiveness or lack of it, their dangerous side effects, their potential for addiction, or worse. His view seems to be that, so long as the patient is free of coercion, he or she is also free to take whatever drugs might be prescribed for him or her. Caveat emptor. Indeed, he says, quote, "By dwelling on the deleteriousness of ECT or neuroleptic drugs, the ostensible critics of psychiatry try to beat psychiatrists at their own game and on their own grounds. In the process, the critics neglect to use their strongest weapon, namely, insisting that the controversy is not about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of any particular psychiatric intervention, but about consent versus coercion." End of quote. This explains why incarcerating innocent persons, This explains why incarcerating innocent persons in mental hospitals and freeing guilty persons from prisons have always been, to quote, "and continue to be the psychiatrist's two most important social functions." Let us be honest, says Szasz, quote, "Classifying non-diseases as diseases serves the economic, existential, and professional interest of the classifiers, and is, to boot, socially expected of them. For the vast majority of healthcare professionals, especially the legions of psychologists, social workers, grief counselors, and drug abuse specialists, it would be professional suicide to categorize non-diseases correctly. Their very instinct of self-interest opposes such truth-telling." End of quote. Now I will draw to a conclusion. With such language, Szasz would leave our entire field in ruins. This is what I have referred to as Dr. Szasz's gauntlet. How should this challenge be met? We could, as psychiatry by and large has done, simply ignore him. As one psychiatrist colleague of mine said, quote, "It has been years since I heard him seriously discussed. I don't know if anyone has focused a review just on refuting him. I do see the whole trend of biologic psychiatry as gradually building a case, but it is not generally seen as answering any need to refute him per se. It is hard to frame the question." I do not agree. No matter how much evidence might be built up within biological psychiatry for the logic and the effectiveness of pharmacological intervention, and the record thus far is not promising, Dr. Szasz's positions would remain unscathed. The questions have been framed, and they still continue, and they still would continue, unanswered. And here they are. 1. If mental illness is a myth, is there a rationale for the state to confine and to forcibly medicate someone, for the use of the insanity defense, and for the spending of public monies, for example, Medicaid, as well as private medical insurance benefits, even for voluntary psychotherapy? 2. If psychiatric diagnoses are bogus contrivances, then do we have any basis for thinking that there is a scientifically legitimate and efficacious basis for ordering unwanted behavior? 3. If psychotherapy is a myth, then is it time to consider, as several states did with regard to the practice of medicine itself in the early 19th century, decertifying its practice as an ineffective enterprise? And 4. If individuals are indeed moral agents responsible for their behavior, then is the entire edifice of experimental, developmental, and clinical psychology thereby threatened? My own answers to these 4 questions are no, yes, no, and no. But we have a lot of work to do to flesh out these answers and to move ICSPP from being a cacophony of complainers about Big Pharma to the center of efforts to recreate a scientific and philosophic basis for the mental health professions free of the ideological cant of either the left or the right. Much of that work will, to use Szasz's phrasing, challenge our every instinct of self-interest.